The Girl Scouts Canoe Trip, Chapter 19, The Rescue. John Hadley and Jack Wilkinson left on Tuesday morning long before the girls were up. They decided first of all to go back to the farmhouse and ask about the path beside the creek, and then to go over it, every inch of the way on foot. And then if they still found no trace, they meant to get a detective. For the situation was now thoroughly alarming. The girls had probably been kidnapped and hidden somewhere by the old man who was seeking the reward. Perhaps they were even suffering some sort of torture. The boys reached the farmhouse about 7:30. Jack stayed in the car, driving it very slowly, while John ran on ahead. In a minute he joined his companion. Unfortunately, Mrs. Higgins still had no news of the girls or of the stranger. "She says there's a road not far from the footpath," said John. "So you drive on and I'll walk." "I hardly think this is going to help us any, but we may as well follow it out as quickly as possible and then go to Beasley again for a detective." They proceeded thus for about 4 miles, progressing very carefully and watching for canoes and the girls, and empty barns and houses where they might be hidden. They were quite near to the very house where the girls were imprisoned when they encountered a Boy Scout. He ran out from the path and placed himself in front of the car, all of the while waving his hands frantically. "Stop! Stop!" he cried, just as Jack brought the car to a standstill. John scampered over from the wood path to hear what the commotion was about. "I see you're a scout," said John, saluting and extending his hand for a handshake. "What can we do to help you?" "It's a girl in trouble," he exclaimed. "She's held prisoner up in a farmhouse beside the creek, in fact. There are 2 girls. Jack was out of the car in a flash. Wildly he grasped the boy's arm. "It's my sister," he cried. "Tell us quick." "Well, I don't know why she's held there, but she sent me a semaphore message to get help. She must be a Girl Scout to know the code, I mean." "Did she have light hair and brown eyes?" questioned John, almost shouting his words in his excitement. "Search me," replied the other. "Her hair is light. It's pretty, too, but I don't know about the color of her eyes." "It must be Marge," said Jack. "Oh, I know it is. Oh, don't let's waste a minute." "Come on, into the car," cried John. "Can we drive right up to the door?" "Bob Felton's my name," replied the other. "Yes, we can drive right up to the porch, but I wish we had a pistol or something to protect us. Maybe the people are crazy." Jack patted his pocket significantly. "We've each got a gun," he said. "By Jimmy, if I get my hands on that fellow, I'll choke him till his eyes fall out," raged John, furious with anger. Jack drove his machine as fast as he dared over the uneven road for about half a mile, and then, directed by Bob Felton, he turned down a narrow path which led to the creek. "That's the place," cried Bob suddenly. "See it? That hole? Why, it's not fit for a dog." "Hadn't we better stop the car here, under cover, and sneak up on them?" suggested Bob. "Nix," replied John. "We drive right up to the house. We're going to claim them, not steal 'em back again, and I guess they've already heard our engine anyway." Boldly, Jack drove directly to the front of the house, or rather until a rickety fence barred further progress, and suddenly applied the brakes. A dirty mongrel hound came racing out from the back, barking furiously. But the boys never hesitated. Before the car had come to a halt, John was out of it, and notwithstanding to pass through the gate, he vaulted the fence with a bound and strode across the intervening space of yard to the door, keeping his hand on the revolver in his side pocket. Nor were the other 2 boys far behind them. Unmindful of the mangy cur which noisily threatened an assault upon their legs from the rear, they were at John's heels when he sprang up the steps of the porch. The Widow Brown, having heard them approach, and thinking all the while that it was the old man who was returning, appeared suddenly in the doorway, just as John had raised his clenched hand to pound upon the door. John was somewhat taken aback upon being thus unexpectedly confronted by a woman when he had expected to see a man, and his fist arrested in mid-air, he blurted out, Where, we want the 2 girls who are prisoners here. Where are they?" The woman shrank back in consternation before the look of righteous wrath on the face of the young man, who, with upraised hand, appeared about to strike her. She trembled violently and wondered whether she could call to her brother, who was out in the stable and had evidently not heard the quiet motor of the big car when it approached. But knowing her guilt, her terror at the determined attitude of the 3 boys prevented her from uttering a sound, and before she could even stammer a reply to John's question, Marjorie and Lily, having heard his stern voice, demanded them, came bounding down the stairs. Why, sir, oh, do have mercy," begged Mrs. Brown, shrinking in a heap at the boys' feet. But the girls, hardly noticing her, stepped over her and rushed towards the boys. "Thank heavens!" cried Marjorie, flinging her arms around her brother's neck and laughing and crying at the same time. Frida, in her turn, grasped the hand of the unknown scout and squeezed it gratefully. "Let's get away at once," begged Marjorie. "I can't stand it here another minute." "Suppose you all wait a minute," called a voice behind them. Turning quickly, they beheld the man of the place standing behind the car, the sharp points of his pitchfork resting against a tire, as if he were about to damage it. "Get away from that car, you contemptible skunk," shouted John, advancing towards him. The man raised his pitchfork threateningly. "Throw down that fork, or I'll let daylight into you," cried John, whipping out his revolver. At the sight of the weapon, the man became instantly cowed. He tossed the fork hastily away from him. "Now come over here and explain yourself," ordered the boy. "I ain't doing nothin'," whined the other, entering nevertheless through a break in the fence. "Ain't done nothin'," mimicked John. "You've kidnapped 2 innocent girls in a crime that's punishable by a long term of imprisonment. Don't you call that something? What's the big idea, anyhow?" The man cringed at these words, displayed even less courage than his sister had, but seeing that John was replacing his revolver in his pocket, he took heart again. "No, I didn't neither," he replied, and he proceeded to relate the whole story, all the while proclaiming that he was innocent. "But who is this old man?" demanded Jack. "Surely you know him." "I never saw him before in my life," declared the man. "Nor I," chimed in his sister. "Is there an insane asylum anywhere around?" asked Jack. "No, nearer than 25 miles," answered Mrs. Brown. "Well, let this be a lesson to you. You deserve to be punished, but since we are going away quickly, we'll let the matter drop." "But it was a mean, contemptible trick," concluded Jack. The young people quickly got into the machine and drove off, completely exhausted after their severe mental strain. In less than half an hour, they had driven into the grounds. The party were sitting around on the porch talking. With a cry of joy, Marjorie jumped out of the car and embraced Miss Phillips. In the presence of her captain, the girl seemed to gain something of her old self-control. It was then that Marjorie finally realized that Mr. and Mrs. Andrews were responsible for the whole trip, and that the palatial house was to be theirs. "Oh, I'm so glad we're going to have the whole week," she said, "thanks to our new friend and deliverer, Robert Felton." "Yes, and you're in time for the meet tomorrow," added Mrs. Andrews. "We shall be glad to have you stay." She turned towards the boy hospitably. "Are you far from home?" "Not very," replied Bob. "We live in Beasley." "Then you can join our party." "Oh, do," pleaded Frida. "There's a canoe meet on hand for tomorrow," put in Mr. Andrews, "and tennis matches for Thursday and Friday. The boys are to take part in them, too. They're to be mixed doubles." The boy's eyes shone with anticipation, and program was decidedly to his liking. "I'd love to stay," he said enthusiastically. "May I call my mother on the telephone? I'll need some clothes." The mention of his mother brought Marjorie back to her own situation. "Thank goodness my mother didn't know what happened to us," she said fervently. "If she had, it would have worried her to death." "I'm going to phone Dad tonight, though," announced Jack, "so that he can get on that old nut's trail. I'll never rest till the mystery's solved." "No, for the man may go right on persecuting other girls," remarked Mr. Andrews. The sound of the happy voices from the driveway interrupted the conversation. "Wait till they see you," chuckled Jack. "Won't they get the surprise of their lives?" "The most joyful one, too," said Mrs. Andrews. "At least, it will be for Lily." The party now emerged from the trees which had hidden them from the view of the porch. Alice Endicott was the first to become aware of their presence. "They're found!" she shrieked, darting towards them. "Oh, look, people, Marge and Frida!" Instantly, they all began to run towards the porch. Lily was the first to throw her arms around Marjorie. Kisses, embraces, questions, and explanations followed in such rapid succession that Mrs. Andrews had to call for order amidst the wild confusion. "Have mercy on these poor girls," she entreated. "Remember, Marjorie and Frida have been under a terrible strain." In the interval that followed, Marjorie had an opportunity to study Ruth's face. The girl was vainly striving for control. She was attempting with that artificial smile of hers to cover the feeling in her heart, but Marjorie knew her well enough to read her like a book. "Ruth's disappointed," she thought to herself. "Of course she didn't want Frida or me to compete tomorrow." She was surprised to find Harold Mason most cordial, for she knew he had never liked her. He even went out of his way to come over to the couch hammock where she was seated and start a conversation with her, asking her all about her experience, but she longed to forget all about it. So at the first opportunity she changed the subject. "By the way, you aren't a scout, are you?" she asked him, as they watched Bob Felton reappear from the house. "Hardly," he replied loftily. "I'm a college man." "Yes, I know," said Marjorie, "but so is John, and yet he still considers himself a scout. Don't you, John?" "Indeed I do," answered the young man, glad to be noticed again. "Once a scout, always a scout, even though you are too old to be an active member." "I'm not one of the party," explained Harold. "I just dropped in as I passed by to see Ruth. I'm leaving tomorrow." Marjorie glanced at Ruth for the reason for this assertion, for she knew that the hospitable host and hostess would be glad to include him in their party. Marjorie and Frida went to their rooms. They were so happy to be away from the terrible house they had been imprisoned in. Chapter 20. A Second Attempt. After the girls had rested and had time to catch up with everyone in their party, Wednesday arrived. The day of the canoe meet had at last come. Marjorie awakened with a sense of anticipation. She was extremely happy, for she was free to take part in the contest. "Hello, Marge. You awake?" called Doris from the single bed beside her. "Aren't you glad it's clear?" "I certainly am," replied the girl, "and I'm glad I'm here." "I am too. Oh, Marge, I surely do hope you get that cup." "Why, Doris, what about yourself? Don't you want to win it?" Doris reached for her kimono and proceeded to get out of bed. "You know I don't stand a chance," she said, "so I'd rather have you win it." "It's awfully sweet of you," murmured Marjorie, as she too dressed. "Do you feel all right? Rested, I mean?" pursued Doris. "Yes, indeed. And did you dream about that old man last night, Marjorie?" asked Mrs. Andrews, as Marjorie met her in the hall. "Indeed I didn't," replied the girl heartily. "I had a good sleep. All I dreamed about was the lovely time we're going to have today and the rest of the week." "If it only doesn't rain," observed Bob Fenton. "With such heat." "Oh, come now, don't be a killjoy, Felton," remarked Jack. "It isn't going to shower." "I hope you're right, Jack," sighed Marjorie. Wouldn't it be awful if we couldn't have the canoe meet after all our experiences?" "Oh, we'd have it," reassured Mrs. Andrews. "And if all of the afternoons are planned for, we'll schedule it for a morning." The talk drifted to tennis, and Ruth noticed with uneasiness that the couples were pairing up. In the hope that John Hartley might ask her, she deferred giving her final answer to Harold, for although Marjorie was to play with Griffith Hunter, it would still be a triumph to oppose her in league with such a partner as John. "You girls who are taking part in the canoe meet this afternoon had better take things easy this morning," advised Mrs. Andrews. "From what I heard your captain tell of the program, it's to be pretty strenuous." The more energetic members of the party spent the early part of the morning on the tennis courts practicing for their new partners. With the exception of Ruth and Francis and 2 or 3 of the boys, all of the young people assembled on the porch about 12:30, clad in raincoats. Harold was standing beside his car holding the door open. "And might I have the honor to drive our brave heroine to the lake?" he asked, with a deep bow. Marjorie hesitated a moment, and Doris answered for her. "Yes, that's a good idea, Harold," she said. "These girls need all the rest they can get. Jump in, Marge and Frida." The girls laughingly obeyed, and Harold followed them before the rest of the party had even left the steps. The Ford had reached the gate. "How far is it to the lake?" asked Marjorie. "About 10 minutes' walk, I should judge," replied the boy. "I guess we can make it in 2. "Oh, Mr. Mason," said Frida, who had been carefully watching the young man's manipulation of the car, "could I possibly drive? I always wanted to, and never had a chance to learn." Harold's eyes brightened. Fate seemed almost to play into his hands. "Certainly," he said pleasantly, "but not on this road. There's too much traffic. Shall I turn back to that unfrequented one near the woods?" "Would you mind, Marge?" asked Frida, turning towards her companion. "Just for about 15 minutes. "Certainly not," said Marjorie. "I didn't want to stay in the lake long, just as long as I get my dip and we can get back to the house by 1:15, so that I can dress in time for lunch. So go ahead if you want to." Frida moved to the front of the car, and Harold began to explain in detail the workings of the car. So fascinated was she that she hardly noticed how far they had gone or how lovely the road was. "By the way, we haven't any watches," exclaimed Marjorie. "How shall we know what time it is?" "Oh, we won't stay long," said Harold. "Besides, I know a shortcut through the town district. We're really driving around the outskirts, I think." Harold stopped the car now, and Frida moved over to the wheel. With all the tremulous earnestness of a novice, she allowed the car to wobble from side to side. "Oh, do be careful, Frida," warned Marjorie. "We'll hit a tree, I bet." "No, we won't," said Harold calmly. "Miss Hammer is really doing very well. Now let's see if you know how to stop." Frida accordingly proceeded to demonstrate her ability along this line, stepping and starting about 15 times in succession, and usually stalling her motor by the way. All of this consumed time, and as Harold realized to his satisfaction, glancing at the speedometer, he ascertained that even with this interrupted progress, they had already covered 3 miles. Figuring from the position of the sun and the length of time they had been out, he decided it must be nearly 1:30. "Don't you think we had better turn back?" suggested Marjorie, who was beginning to feel rather hungry. "It must be getting late. This road ought to take us back to the other and to Silverton, if we keep on the same way we are going," replied Harold. "But if you stop a minute, I'll look under the back seat for my map. That ought to tell us." "Do I have to stop?" entreated Frida. "Please let me keep on running it till we get back to civilization." Harold deliberated a moment. Ordinarily, he would not have considered taking such a chance as allowing a novice to run his Ford, even for a few seconds, without his hand behind the wheel to grasp it in case of an accident. But now he was willing to risk almost anything which might make them delay. The meet was called for 3 o'clock. Even if Marjorie did get there in time, she could not exercise on an empty stomach, nor yet could she swim right after eating. His plans were working beautifully. Perhaps, after all, he might succeed. "You run slowly, then," he finally said to Frida, "while Marjorie and I look for the map. But please be careful." The new driver felt quite sure of herself and went ahead slowly while Marjorie and Harold rummaged under the back seat for the map. Among the tools, oil cans, and dirty rags, Marjorie suddenly caught sight of a piece of gray wig. "What's this?" she demanded with curiosity, holding up the straggly hair. "You wear a wig, Harold? Or false whiskers?" Every bit of color left the boy's face as he beheld the telltale object. Wildly, he sought for an explanation. "Oh, that! Why, I'm in a play. An old grandfather, you know." He turned to the map, which he had just managed to locate, and busied himself in contemplation of it. "Say, Frida," continued Marjorie, still looking at the wig, "this sort of reminds me of our old friend. Look." The temptation was too much for the girl. Forgetful of her occupation, her head swung around instantly to behold the object of Marjorie's interest. But in that second, she lost control of her wheel and the car swerved to the left, and before she could put on the emergency, plunged headlong into a tree. With a crash, the front of the radiator cracked, and the water began to run out from the leak. "Uh-oh, what have I done?" she gasped in terror. Though rather appalled at the damage, Harold realized in a flash that the accident had accomplished two ends. It would serve to make Marjorie forget about the gray hair and his embarrassment over its discovery, and it would render it impossible for Marjorie and Frida to take part in the meet. For they had now gone almost 5 miles on a lonely road where few cars even passed, and from all calculations it should be 2 o'clock. The girls could not make the journey, have their lunch, and be ready for the meet by 3. His victory was assured. Ruth would have to admit that he was clever. And besides, he was all the while seemingly innocent. "Don't worry, Miss Hammer," he said politely. "It can easily be fixed." At these words he got out of the car and went around to the front to examine the damage. It was even worse than he had surmised. It would be impossible to get back now without a tow. "But we'll miss the meet," sobbed Frida, now almost in hysterics. "To think that after all we've gone through—" "Oh, cheer up. Maybe there will be a car along," said Harold. "Anyway, you girls can start to walk. Perhaps it isn't so far. I'll have to stay here with the car. When you get to Silverton, will you send someone to the garage for me?" "Oh, Marge, we can't make it. Not possibly." The girl began to cry afresh. "No, if we stand here all day," said Marjorie, a little sharp. She was disappointed, dismayed at the turn in the events had taken. It was hard to see the silver cup almost within her grasp, and then to lose it through no fault of her own. "Sorry to leave you, Harold," she said, "but we'll send help. So long." "Goodbye," he answered in a tone of assumed distress. The girls began to walk very fast, breaking now and then into a run, and talking little in order to save their breath. "If we only had a watch," sighed Marjorie after they had gone about half a mile. "You'll never forgive me, will you, Marge?" wailed Frida again. In her own mind, she was the chief of sinners. "Nonsense, Frida. It was an accident. Oh, look, the sun's gone in. Now we can't possibly tell the time." "I'm baked," cried Frida, stopping suddenly. "I can't stand this raincoat another minute." "Nor I either," agreed Marjorie, and both girls took them off. "There's the house ahead," announced Marjorie. About 10 minutes later. "If we could only get a piece of bread." "And find out what time it is," added the other. All the while the atmosphere was growing heavier and stiller, and the clouds blacker and blacker. So hot, so tired, so hungry were the girls, however, that they hardly noticed the approaching storm, keeping their eyes fixed on the house in the distance. They walked with grim determination towards their goal. The house, though not large, was attractive and well kept. The girls greeted it with a sigh of relief. "I hope we won't be kidnapped if we dare to go in," said Marjorie jokingly. A pleasant-faced woman answered their knock. In a few hurried words Marjorie told the story and asked for the time and for a drink. 5 minutes of 3, answered the woman, glancing at the clock. "We've lost out," gasped Rita. "In 5 minutes the canoe meet starts." "Not if I know it," said the woman cheerfully, throwing wide open the door. "Just look at the rain. Come on inside, or you'll catch your death of cold." And so a second time Harold Mason's attempt to help Ruth came to naught. Chapter 21. The Storm. When the young people reached the bathing beach, they were surprised not to find Frida and Marjorie already there, nor was there a sign of the Ford car. "A puncture, I'll bet," laughed Ruth. "Harold always does have the worst luck. Remember that time, Jack?" "Indeed I do," he replied. "And weren't we mad, though? Marge profited by the delay then, didn't she? But not this time." "Well, she and Frida can easily walk unless they insist on helping Harold," said Lily. "I hope they come soon." But when half an hour had passed and had not put in an appearance, Lily grew anxious. "Suppose that crazy fool got them again," she said. "Oh, Harold could easily beat him up," remarked Ruth. "He's strong." "But crazy people are supposed to have extraordinary strength." "What time is it, Mr. Remington?" asked John Hadley. 5 minutes after 1. "Something has happened," cried Lily in a terror-stricken voice. "Oh, why did we ever let them out of our sight?" All this time Ruth could hardly suppress the feeling of exhilaration that was taking possession of her. Was Harold really succeeding? Might she win after all? Then she felt a momentary pang of fear lest the accident, whatever it was, might be too obvious and Marjorie's keen mind might discover an underlying motive. But after all, the possibility of such a thing was slight. Harold was too clever for that. All the joyousness of breakfast party had vanished when the guests assembled for their noonday meal. The subject was all absorbing. No one talked of anything else. "What I can't understand is why we didn't pass them on the road," said Jack. "If anything had happened to the machine, we ought to have seen it." "That's true, unless they went for a little spin," said Ruth. "And what time is the meet?" asked David, voicing the question that was uppermost in everybody's mind. 3 o'clock, replied Mrs. Andrews. "Felton," said John Hadley, "will you go out on the search party with me after lunch? You were successful before." "We'll be only too glad to go," replied the other, without the least hesitation. At 2:30, all the girls except Doris and Alice, who had decided not to enter the meet, retired to their rooms to dress. "Lily Andrews, you move about like an old woman," teased Ethel, "and if you don't get any more pep than that, you surely won't win." "If you keep on crying, the lake will overflow into the town," put in Ruth. Lily smiled through her tears. "I can't help it, girls. I'm scared about Marge and Frida." "Oh, I guess they're all right," said Ruth. "Try to brace up, Lil." By 2:45, the young people had all assembled on the porch, ready to get into the cars that were waiting at the steps. They were gazing doubtfully at the sky, for the clouds which had been gathering for the last half hour now hung dark and threatening above them. "I guess Bob was right," remarked Jack. "We're due for a downpour." "Maybe it will pass over," said Ruth optimistically. She longed for her chance to prove herself the victor. Now it seemed impossible that some unfortunate circumstance like rain might spoil it all. "You can't any of you go a step," announced Mrs. Andrews, suddenly appearing in the doorway. "There's going to be an awful storm." Ruth was about to open her mouth in another utterance of protest when the rain began to pour down in torrents. "Well, that settles it," said Mr. Remington. "No more arguments now. "But it might clear up in time," said Ruth hopefully. "It doesn't look much like it," said Miss Phillips. Ruth turned away dismayed, angered, and disheartened. Harold had been successful, but all to no purpose. Curling up the corner of the hammock, she gave herself up to her own gloomy thoughts. "And I wonder where Marge and Frida are now," observed Doris. "And Harold," said Ruth. "And John and Bob," said Mr. Andrews. The rain became so heavy that the guests were forced to seek shelter indoors, abandoning all ideas of holding the meet. The girls excused themselves to go upstairs. About 4 o'clock the rain slackened to a slow drizzle, and promised to continue for the remainder of the afternoon and evening. At 4:30, one of Mr. Andrews' big cars stopped at the steps, and to everyone's intense relief, Bob and John jumped out. The girls were with them, and so was Harold Mason. We found Marge and Frida several miles up the road, taking refuge from the rain in a house, and poor Mason was sitting all alone in that busted Lizzie, said John in answer to the eager questions put to them from all present. "We were scared for fear that the old man had got hold of you again," said Lily. "You didn't see anything of him, did you?" "Only his beard," laughed Marjorie, drawing the shock of gray hair from her pocket. "I found this in the back of Harold's car." Although the owner was inwardly dumbfounded at these words, only Marjorie and Ruth noticed any embarrassment in his manner as he stumbled upon an explanation. "Oh, that!" he laughed. "I'm Foxy Grandpop in a play at home, and that's part of the makeup. And that reminds me, Mrs. Andrews, that we have a dress rehearsal tomorrow, which I must attend, so I'm afraid I'll have to leave right away." "But your car," interrupted Jack. "I'll have to go by train, but if I phone to the garage to get it and fix it up, couldn't you drive it down, Wilkinson? Or Ruth, you could." "Certainly," answered Ruth, perceiving how uncomfortable Harold's position was and realizing how he longed to escape. "Go by all means. It'll be a lark to drive it down." "And I promise not to touch the wheel, Mr. Mason," said Frida penitently, as the guests separated. Since the rain seemed likely to continue all evening, Mrs. Andrews suggested a program of bridge and other games. The young people assented joyfully, pleading, however, for half an hour or so to make their final tennis arrangements, for Mr. Andrews said he could postpone the entries no longer. Immediately after dinner, with a feeling of something like relief, Ruth watched Harold depart, fearing that Marjorie might know more than she should about the adventure. She wished to have the remainder of the incident banished from their presence. "I will read the entries, and I have so far," announced Mr. Andrews, calling the young people to attention. "And those who haven't already registered, please ask your partner to do so without delay." "And when does the canoe meet come off?" asked Marjorie. "Saturday morning," replied Mrs. Andrews, "and the tennis finals Friday afternoon." And we will continue the rest of the book, which is the end, on Wednesday next. And thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.